My name is Alex Easton. For the better part of a decade, I worked as a senior archivist for a major metropolitan museum. A career that sounds far more tranquil than it is. The reality was a life lived under the constant, low, great assault of the city. The percussive rattle of subway trains vibrating through the floor. The incessant chorus of sirens that were so common they became meaningless background noise. The sheer, psychic weight of millions of lived in such close, clamoring proximity. I craved silence. Not just the absence of noise, but a deep, foundational quiet that I felt I had lost somewhere in my 20s. And so, after a modest inheritance gave me the freedom to do so, I sought it out. My search led me to Havenwood, tucked away in a fold of rolling hills and dense, old, growth forests. The town was the very picture of rustic serenity. The online listings showed a small, self-contained community with a quaint town square, a single general store, a post office, and a beautiful stone-built library that made my professional heart ache with longing. It was perfect. I purchased a small, clapboard house on the edge of town, one that backed onto the woods, and imagined a life of quiet research, writing, and listening to the sound of the wind in the pines. For the first 2 weeks, Havenwood was everything I had dreamed of. The quiet was so profound, it was almost a physical presence. It settled over the town like a soft blanket, muffling the world. The people were pleasant in a reserved, small-town way. A nod from Mrs. Gable at the general store. A quiet afternoon from the sheriff, a man whose name I learned was Miller. A brief chat about the weather with my neighbor, Mr. Abernathy, as he meticulously tended his rose bushes. They were polite, but not effusive. Their conversations were brief, their smiles genuine but fleeting. There was a placid, uniform calm to them all, an unruffled quality that I initially mistook for contentment. I began to notice small oddities, the kind of details an archivist is trained to spot. Strange, woven figures, like small, desiccated men made of corn husks and twine, hung from the eaves of many houses, including my own. They were weathered and ancient-looking. When I asked Mr. Abernathy about the one on my porch, he simply smiled his placid smile. Just a bit of town tradition, he'd said, his eyes not quite meeting mine. Brings good fortune. I also noted the curious absence of squirrels and most common birds in the town proper. The woods were alive with them, but it was as if an invisible line had been drawn at the town's edge that they would not cross. These were minor dissonances, easily dismissed quirks of a secluded community. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in my 3rd week, I heard the siren. It was not the familiar, rising and falling wail of a city fire engine or ambulance. This was something else entirely. It began as a low, resonant hum. A vibration I felt in the floorboards and in my teeth before I properly heard it. The hum grew steadily, climbing the scale into a single, piercing, mechanical shriek that was impossibly loud. It was a clean, industrial sound, yet it had a strange, almost organic overtone. A dissonant chord that seemed to scrape at the inside of my skull. It was a sound of pure, undiluted alarm. My first instinct, born of city life, was to look out the window for smoke or signs of panic. I saw neither. Instead, I witnessed something far more unsettling. With a synchronicity that was utterly unnatural, Havenwood simply stopped. Mrs. Gable, who had been sweeping her storefront, calmly put her broom aside, went inside, and locked the door. Mr. Abernathy, who had been on his knees in his garden, stood up, dusted off his trousers, and walked into his house without a backward glance. A delivery truck that had been rumbling down Main Street pulled silently to the curb, its engine cutting out. Within 30 seconds of the siren's first note, the streets were empty. The town was still. The siren blared for exactly 5 minutes. When it cut off, the silence it left behind was absolute, a vacuum that was heavier and more profound than the usual quiet. It was a weighted, listening silence. I stood at my window for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt exposed, a solitary figure in a ghost town. After another 10 minutes, just as unnervingly synchronized as their disappearance, the people returned. Doors unlocked. The delivery truck started its engine. Mrs. Gable resumed her sweeping. It was as if nothing had happened. The next day, I tried to ask about it. My curiosity was simple, unalarming. I was at the general store, buying milk. That was quite a siren yesterday, I said to Mrs. Gable, forcing a casual laugh. Tornado drill? She smiled, the same placid, distant smile as everyone else. Oh, that old thing, she said, her hands busy arranging a display of canned peaches. Don't you pay it any mind. But what is it for? I pressed gently. Eyes it from the old fire station. It's just something the town does, dear, she replied, her tone one of finality, though it remained perfectly pleasant. A tradition, you could say. Like the figures. I tried the sheriff later that week, catching him as he was getting into his cruiser. Sheriff Miller. I began. I was just wondering about the siren protocol. In case of a real emergency, am I supposed to do anything specific? He turned, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Annoyance, or perhaps warning. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same practiced calm. No protocol to worry about, Mr. Easton. You're safe here in Havenwood. That's the whole point of this place. He gave a short nod, got in his car, and drove away, leaving me standing on the curb, with my unanswered question hanging in the air. It was the same everywhere I went. The librarian, a young woman named Clara, simply shook her head with a little smile and changed the subject to a new shipment of books. The postman pretended not to hear me over the sound of his sorting. It was a wall of pleasant, smiling denial. They weren't hostile or secretive in a way that felt aggressive. Their refusal to engage was so gentle, so uniform. It felt like a form of mass gaslighting. They were all reading from the same script, and the core message was that I was the strange one for even asking. After a week of these polite deflections, I started to question my own judgment. Was I being paranoid? Was this some bizarre social test for the new resident? A local joke I wasn't privy to. But the feeling of profound wrongness wouldn't leave me. It lingered. A cold spot in the otherwise warm and welcoming town. The siren sounded again 2 weeks later, exactly the same as before. The rising hum, the 5-minute shriek, the synchronized disappearance of the townsfolk, and the heavy, listening silence that followed. This time, I watched from my upstairs window, my study, which overlooked the woods. As the town fell silent, my eyes were drawn to the forest edge. I saw nothing, of course, just the deep, dark green of the pines and the shadows gathering beneath them. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence wasn't empty. The town wasn't hiding from the siren. They were hiding from what the siren called forth. Or, perhaps, what it kept at bay. That night, unable to sleep, I sat on my porch, the woven husk figure swinging gently in the breeze beside me. It looked like a tiny, screaming man, its twined limbs twisted in silent agony. I had lived in a city where 1,000 sirens a day signaled 1,000 individual tragedies. They were loud, chaotic, and honest. Here, there was only one siren. It was clean, orderly, and punctual. And it was built on a foundation of terrifying, unspoken consensus. It was a signal, I was beginning to realize, not of an emergency, but of an agreement. A terrible, recurring appointment that the entire town was complicit in keeping. And the most frightening part was the placid, unwavering silence they maintained about it. It was a silence that felt older and more powerful than any sound. A silence that held the town in its grip. I knew then that I couldn't let it go. I had come to Havenwood seeking quiet, but the quiet I had found was the most horrifying noise of all. My professional life had taught me one fundamental truth. People lie, but paper remembers. Every community, no matter how small or secretive, leaves a trail. Town charters, meeting minutes, census data, local newspapers. These are the bones of a place's history, and I was an expert at articulating their skeletons. The wall of placid denial I'd encountered was social. The archives, I reasoned, would be silent, impartial, and, most importantly, honest. My investigation began, naturally, at the stone-built library I had so admired. Clara, the librarian, was behind the circulation desk, stamping books with a rhythmic, peaceful thud. Her smile was as serene as ever when I approached. "Mr. Easton," she greeted me, looking for a novel to curl up with. "Actually, Clara, I was hoping to access the town archives. Specifically, old newspapers from, say, the 1920s and 30s. And any town planning records from that era." The smile didn't falter, but it tightened at the edges. A flicker of something. The same guarded look I'd seen in Sheriff Miller's eyes passed through her own. "Of course. Our collection is in the basement. I'll have to unlock it for you. Though I should warn you, we had a bit of a flood down there years ago. Some of the older records are in poor condition. A real shame." She led me down a narrow set of wooden stairs into a cool, dry basement that smelled of old paper and dust. It was meticulously organized, far from the water, damaged chaos she had described. Bound volumes of the Havenwood Chronicle were lined up on metal shelves. She unlocked a wire mesh gate for me. "Just lock this up when you're done," she said, her voice still light and airy. "And please, be careful. They're very fragile." I spent the next 4 hours surrounded by the ghosts of Havenwood's past. I started with the newspapers. The 1920s were filled with the mundane trivia, a small town life harvest festivals, church bake sales, local politics. But as I moved into the 1930s, I found the gaps. Not just a missing issue here or there, but entire months gone. October 1934, August 1935, October 1936, a biennial pattern of absence. When I cross-referenced the town meeting minutes, I found the same thing. The records for those corresponding months were neatly sliced out of the ledgers with a razor-sharp blade. It wasn't damage. It was surgical removal. A deliberate, careful erasure. Frustrated, I turned my attention to the town's founding. In a box of miscellaneous documents, I found a copy of the original Havenwood Charter from 1856. It was mostly standard legal boilerplate, but one section, Article the Siren, was bizarre. It spoke of the community's duty to uphold cyclical obligations and ensure communal preservation through periodic appeasement. It mentioned a compact with the land itself, a promise to maintain the harmony in exchange for prosperity and protection from the hunger of the wood. It was archaic, unsettling language, more befitting a cult manifesto than a town charter. My search was interrupted by the next siren. It was a Tuesday. I had lost track of the days. The hum started, vibrating up through the concrete floor of the library basement. Upstairs, I heard the gentle thud of the front door being locked. I was alone in the archive, the single bare bulb overhead casting long, dancing shadows. This time the sound felt different. It wasn't just loud. It was predatory. The dissonant overtone felt like a physical pressure against my ears, a scraping sound that seemed to be searching for a way into my head. I felt a primal urge to hide, to curl up in the darkest corner of the basement and wait it out. Instead, I forced myself up the stairs. The library was empty, bathed in the eerie afternoon light, filtering through the tall windows. I crept to the front door and peered through the glass. The street was utterly still, a perfect tableau of a town holding its breath. But my eyes were drawn to the woods, at the end of the street. The siren was meant to drive people indoors, to make them hide. But what if its true purpose was to clear the stage for something else? As the siren reached its 5-minute crescendo and cut out, the silence that fell was different. It wasn't just heavy, it was hungry. And in that silence, I heard it. A faint, wet, rhythmic tearing sound coming from the direction of the woods. It was accompanied by a smell that drifted on the air, a coppery, metallic scent like a slaughterhouse, mixed with the cloying sweetness of pine sap. My blood ran cold. It was the sound of feeding. My heart hammered in my chest as I fumbled with the lock on the wire, mesh gate to the archives. My hands shaking too much to work the key. I left it unlocked and hurried out of the library's back entrance, my mind reeling. The polite smiles, the gentle deflections, they were all a mask for this monstrous, recurring event. The next day, the atmosphere in town had changed. The placid calm was still there, but now it felt brittle, like a sheet of ice over a dark, deep lake. The smiles didn't reach anyone's eyes. The nods were curt. I was no longer just the curious newcomer. I was a threat. I felt their eyes on me as I walked to the general store, their gazes lingering a moment too long. The unspoken consensus had shifted. I had looked behind the curtain, and they knew it. That evening, as dusk settled over the valley, Sheriff Miller's cruiser pulled up to my house. He didn't use his lights or siren. He just appeared, a dark shape in the twilight. He got out of the car and walked slowly to my porch, stopping at the bottom of the steps. He didn't smile. "Mr. Easton," he said, his voice low and even. "I heard you were asking about our town's history. Found your time in the archives fruitful." I stood in my doorway, the frame feeling like the only solid thing in the world. "I found some inconsistencies," I said, my own voice tight. Miller nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on mine. "Havenwood is a special place. A quiet place. People come here for that quiet. They respect it. They understand that some things are best left undisturbed. They don't go poking around in basements, asking questions that have no answers." He took a step closer, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol. "You came here seeking quiet, didn't you? I strongly suggest you find it. Stop digging. Because some histories are buried for a reason. And if you dig them up, you might just find yourself buried with them." He held my gaze for a long moment, the threat hanging in the air, as sharp and clear as the siren's shriek. Then he turned, walked back to his cruiser, and drove away, leaving me alone in the deepening darkness. The woven husk figure on my porch swung in the breeze, its silent scream a mirror of my own. I now understood. The siren wasn't a drill or a tradition. It was a dinner bell. And the entire town was dedicated to making sure the meal was served on time. My isolation was no longer just social. It was absolute. I was a loose thread in their perfect, horrifying tapestry, and I had a sinking feeling they were about to pull me. Sheriff Miller's threat was a turning point. The town's mask of pleasantries didn't just slip, it was cast aside. The quiet nods ceased. The fleeting smiles vanished. Now, when I walked down Main Street, I was met with flat, hard stares. Conversations would stop as I approached, resuming in hushed tones only after I had passed. "Mr. Abernathy no longer tended his roses. Instead, he seemed to spend his days watching my house from his porch, his stillness more unnerving than any overt action. The quiet I had once craved had become a weapon, a suffocating blanket of communal hostility. I was no longer a resident. I was a specimen under a microscope. My isolation became physical. The day after Miller's visit, my landline went dead. When I tried my cell phone, there was no signal, a problem I'd never had before. I walked to the general store to report it, and Mrs. Gable gave me a thin, pitying look. "Lines must be down," she said, not bothering to check. "Happens out here." My internet flickered and died that afternoon. The next morning, when I tried to start my car to drive to the next town over, the engine wouldn't turn over. It was a systematic, deliberate severing of my connections to the outside world. They were tightening the net, and the dread was a physical weight in my chest, a constant, low hum of terror that mimicked the siren itself. Panic began to set in, a cold, sharp, I was trapped. My house, once my sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Driven by a desperate, frantic energy, I began to search it, not for a way out, but for an answer. I was an archivist, and my instincts told me that the history of this place, this house, might hold a clue. I ran my hands along the walls, tapped the floorboards, checked for fallbacks in closets. It was in the small study upstairs, the room that overlooked the woods, that I found it. A single floorboard beneath the desk was slightly loose. Using the tip of a letter opener, I pried it up. Beneath it, nestled in the dusty space between the joists, was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with tight, spidery handwriting. A name was inscribed on the inside cover: Elias Thorne. The man who sold me the house. The man who, according to the realtor, had retired to a warmer climate. The journal began much as my own story had, a man seeking refuge from a noisy world. Charmed by Havenwood's serenity, he wrote of the quiet, the polite but distant townsfolk, the strange corn, husk figures. Then came his first entry about the Siren. His confusion mirrored my own, as did his frustration at the wall of smiling denial. But Elias had been here longer. His paranoia had had more time to fester and grow. He started documenting the Siren's schedule, noting its biennial pattern long before I had. He connected it to the gaps in the town's history, the same ones I'd found in the library. October 12th, one entry read: "They are watching me. I see them from the window. They pretend to be gardening, to be fixing their roofs, but they are always watching. They know I have been asking questions. They know I don't belong. The silence is the worst part. It's not empty. It's full of their judgment, their consensus. It presses in on me." Then the journal took a darker turn. Elias wrote about what he called the hum of the earth. He didn't think it was a single creature. He described it as a consciousness in the land itself, a primal hunger that resided in the ancient woods. The siren, he theorized, was a specific harmonic frequency, a key that both called to this entity and placated it, focusing its attention. It was a sound that said, "Here is your due. Be satisfied and leave us in peace." November 3rd, I saw it, or a part of it. After the siren, I hid in the attic and watched the woods. It wasn't a beast of flesh and blood. It was moving earth, roots and soil, and wet leaves, shifting into a form that was horribly, vaguely bipedal. It shambled at the edge of the trees, drawn by the siren's echo. The smell. Oh, God, the smell of rot and fresh blood. It was looking for something. The final section of the journal was where my blood ran truly cold. Elias had finally broken through the town's silence, but not in the way he'd hoped. He'd cornered the librarian, an older woman, not Clara, and demanded answers. And she, perhaps out of pity or a twisted sense of duty, had told him the truth. The siren was a call. The 5 minutes of hiding were a grace period. The tearing sound was the feeding. But the meal wasn't always wild animals. October 20th, he wrote, his handwriting becoming almost illegible. "The harvest. That's what she called it. It's not every time. Only every 2 years. In October. An appeasement, she said, to ensure the town's prosperity, to keep the harmony. They give it something. Someone. An outsider. Someone who doesn't fit. Someone who asks too many questions. The corn husk figures aren't just good luck charms. They are effigies. Representations. They choose one, and they hang the doll on their door. It's a marker. A designation for the hunger. I dropped the journal. My eyes shot to the front porch, to the small, screaming man of woven husk that had been there since I arrived. It wasn't a welcome gift. It was a label. I was the offering. I was the next appeasement. I snatched the journal back up, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The last few pages were filled with frantic plans for escape, plans that were crossed out one by one. His car battery was dead. His tires were slashed. The phone lines were cut. His story was my own, playing out weeks ahead of me. The final entry was dated October 28th, 2 years ago. The whole town is outside. They're not looking at me with anger. It's worse. They're looking at me with a kind of placid reverence. Miller is at the front of the crowd. He's holding a length of rope. They're not going to kill me. They're just going to tie me to the old oak at the edge of the woods. They're going to leave me for the hum. It's not murder, you see. It's tradition. It's just something the town does. I can hear it now. Not the siren, not yet. But the low hum, starting in the earth, coming for. The sentence was unfinished. A wave of nausea and terror washed over me. I stumbled to my study window and looked at the calendar on my desk. My finger traced the date. Tuesday, October 28th. The exact date of Elias Thorne's last entry, 2 years later. My 2-week grace period was over. This wasn't another siren day. This was the harvest. And as the full, horrifying weight of that realization crashed down upon me, I felt it. A low, deep vibration, starting in the soles of my feet and rising up through the floorboards. It was a familiar feeling, the feeling of the siren waking up. But this time I knew what it meant. It wasn't a dinner bell for some random beast. It was a personalized invitation, and my name was on the menu. The hum grew louder, the first note of the shriek beginning to form in the air, a clean, piercing sound that promised not just alarm, but annihilation. The siren's shriek was no longer just a sound in the air. It was a physical force, a needle of pure vibration driving into my skull. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. My limbs felt like lead. My thoughts fractured into 1,000 shards of terror. Through the window, I saw them. The people of Havenwood were emerging from their homes, but not to hide. They were gathering. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, their faces empty of emotion, their eyes fixed on my house. Sheriff Miller was at the front, a thick coil of rope in his hand. Beside him, Mr. Abernathy held a rusty-looking iron lantern. Mrs. Gable, Clara, the postman, they were all there, a silent, placid congregation assembling for a holy rite. Elias's final, unfinished sentence echoed in my mind a coming for. They weren't going to break down the door and drag me out. That would be too chaotic, too disruptive to the harmony. They were going to wait. They would stand there, their collective will a tangible pressure, until I came out to meet my fate. The siren was for me. The 5-minute duration wasn't a grace period for them to hide. It was a countdown for me to surrender. My archivist's mind, so used to finding order in chaos, was failing me. There was no logic here, no record to consult, only the raw, primal truth of the journal, clutched in my hand. They're just going to tie me to the old oak. I wouldn't let that happen. I wouldn't be a placid sacrifice. My house backed onto the woods. It was my only chance. A desperate, suicidal gamble. To flee the shepherds and run directly into the wolf's maw. With a surge of adrenaline, fueled defiance, I scrambled for the back of the house. I could hear the floorboards of the front porch creaking as the first of them took up their positions. I fumbled with the lock on the kitchen door, my hands slick with sweat, and threw it open. I burst out into the cool October air and sprinted across the small, unkempt lawn towards the tree line. I didn't look back. I couldn't bear to see their faces, to see if they were pursuing me or simply watching. Knowing the woods would do their work for them, I plunged into the forest just as the siren cut out. The silence that fell was instantaneous and absolute. It was a physical blow, a crushing weight that stole the air from my lungs. Every sound I made, my ragged breaths, the snap of twigs under my feet, the frantic pounding of my own heart, was an obscenity in this sacred, hungry quiet. The woods were dark, the canopy of ancient pines swallowing the last of the afternoon light. I ran blindly, stumbling over roots, my face whipped by low, hanging branches. Then I heard it, not with my ears, but with my whole body. A low, rhythmic shifting. The wet, tearing sound from my memory, but magnified, closer. The air grew thick with the smell of damp soil, of rot, and the coppery tang of old blood. It was the smell of the earth itself turning over in its sleep, and it was waking up. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Through the trees, I could see the faint, flickering glow of Mr. Abernathy's lantern. They were following not with haste, but with the slow, inexorable patience of pallbearers. They were herding me deeper into the woods, towards the heart of the hunger. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, spongy, and unnaturally yielding. I looked down and saw that the soil was dark and loose, crawling with a lattice of pale, thick roots that seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. I stumbled, catching myself on the trunk of a massive oak, the old oak from Elias's journal. Its bark was scarred with deep gouges, and dark stains soaked the earth around its base. That's when I saw it. It wasn't a creature of flesh and bone that rose from the ground before me. It was the ground itself. Soil, leaf litter, and a writhing mass of pale roots coalesced, heaving upward into a form that was a grotesque parody of a man. It had no face, only a dark, gaping hollow where a mouth should be. Limbs of twisted wood and packed earth scraped against each other as it shambled towards me. The tearing sound the friction of its own impossible body. It was the hum of the earth, the hunger of the wood, the guardian of Havenwood's terrible harmony. I was paralyzed, my defiance extinguished and replaced by a terror so profound, it was almost transcendent. This was not a monster to be fought. It was a geological event. It was a fundamental law of this place, as inescapable as gravity. It reached for me with a limb of woven roots. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat, a knot of pure fear. As the roots touched my leg, I felt no pain, only a strange, pulling cold. The roots burrowed into my skin, not tearing, but merging. I felt myself being drawn down into the soft, hungry earth. My body began to come apart, not in a spray of blood and gore, but in a quiet, horrifying dissolution. My flesh became soil, my bones became roots, my blood became the dark sap of the forest. My consciousness, stretched thin and unraveling, was pulled into the collective. I felt Elias, Thorn there, and countless others before him, their terror and confusion a permanent echo in the soil. I felt the town, their placid satisfaction a distant, steady pulse. They were the keepers, we were the sustenance. This was the compact. This was the price of their peace. My last coherent thought was of the city I had fled. I had hated its noise, its chaos, its clamoring, vibrant life. I had come to Havenwood seeking quiet. As my vision dissolved into a swirling darkness of earth and root, and my sense of self was finally consumed by the great, silent hum, I realized I had found it.